Burkina Faso just lifted the tomato export ban and everyone is celebrating. The trucks are moving. The prices are coming down. Ghana is breathing again. But I need you to hear me very carefully. What the last 2 weeks exposed about this continent, about Ghana, about Nigeria, Ivory Coast, and about Cameroon, that does not disappear because the tomatoes are flowing again. The crisis is over, but the lesson has not even started. If you follow our last episode on Burkina Faso's tomato export ban, you already know how deep this story goes. But what happened today changes the entire conversation. Most people are going to treat the lifting of this ban as the end of the story. It is not. It is the beginning of a much bigger one. So sit down because we are about to break this wide open. Good day, everyone. Whether you're tuning in from the continent of Africa, from the diaspora, or from anywhere else around the world, once again, welcome back to Frontline Africa. Now, this is what is happening. On April 2nd, 2026, the government of Ghana confirmed that Burkina Faso has officially lifted its suspension on the issuance of special export authorizations for fresh tomatoes. That means the cross-border tomato trade that was shut down in mid-March is now back open. And traders, market women, transporters, and consumers across Ghana are breathing again. But let me take you through what happened, why it happened, and what every African country watching this should take from it. The original ban was announced through a joint communique dated March 16, 2026, signed by Burkina Faso's Minister of Industry, Commerce and Artisanat, Sergeant Granodem Poda, and the Minister of State for Agriculture, Water, Animal and Fisheries Resources, Commandant Ismail Sombiye. The directive suspended all fresh tomato exports across the entire national territory until further notice. The issuance of special export authorizations was halted with immediate effect. Exporters with existing permits were given a 2-week window to wrap up their shipments, and after that, every permit was considered invalid. And guess what? The government warned that any goods seized in violation of the directive would be redirected free of charge to local processing factors. The reason Ouagadougou gave for the ban was straightforward. The government said it needed to secure adequate supply for its domestic tomato processing plants. Burkina Faso has been building agro-processing capacity at an aggressive pace. A new tomato processing plant in the country's second largest city, the Burkina Faso Tomato Company, known by its French name, abbreviation as SOPTO, was inaugurated in November 2024. It was funded through 80% citizen investment under a popular shareholding scheme and 20% state participation. A second plant opened in December 2024, and a third facility in the eastern region was reported to be over 70% complete and is expected to come online soon. Those factories need raw tomatoes to operate, and the government made the calculation that every tomato grown on Burkinabe soil should feed Burkinabe factories first. That is the context. That is the logic. And whatever your opinion is on whether the ban was fair to neighboring countries, the reasoning was clear. Burkina Faso prioritized its own industrial development, and it did so in a way that is consistent with a broader continental trend of African governments restricting raw commodity exports to promote local value addition. So, why was the ban lifted? Because this part matters a whole lot. According to a press statement issued by Ghana's Ministry of Trade and Agribusiness in the Industry on April 2nd, the decision to resume exports followed improvements in the supply of fresh tomatoes to Burkina Faso's local processing factories, as well as commitments from stakeholders to continue prioritizing domestic industrial needs. In plain language, the factories got what they needed. The supply pressure eased, and with the domestic processing demand being met, Ouagadougou, decided to reopen the export window. But there is a second factor, and I need you to hear this. Ghana's Trade Minister Elizabeth Ofosu-Adjare held a series of discussions with her Burkinabe counterparts, including a key meeting on the sidelines of the World Trade Organization's 14th Ministerial Conference in Yaoundé, Cameroon. The Ghanaian government described the outcome as a direct result of sustained bilateral engagement. And to be fair, that is how diplomacy is supposed to work. You do not threaten, you do not posture, you sit down, you make your case, and you negotiate a resolution that serves both sides. Ghana did that, and it worked. So, the immediate crisis is over. But let me take you through what those 2 weeks looked like on the ground, because the numbers tell a story that should keep every policymaker on this continent awake at night. Ghana, as we know, needs about 800,000 metric tons of tomatoes a year, produces roughly 510,000, and fills the nearly 300,000 ton gap, mostly with imports from Burkina Faso, especially during the dry season when local output dropped. The country spends close to $100 million every single year on those imports. That is not a small line item. That is a built-in dependency. And built-in dependencies always come with a deadline. When the ban hit, the impact was immediate. Traders across Ghanaian markets reported sharp price increases. In some markets, the price of a crate of tomatoes more than doubled within days. One trader told local media that prices had jumped from around 18 to 22 Ghana cedis to between 32 and 40 cedis. The leader of the National Tomato Traders and Transporters Association described the ban as a shock, warning that it will carry health, economic, and social consequences, pointing out that over 90% of Ghanaians consume tomatoes daily. Northern Ghana was hit the hardest. That region is a primary corridor for agricultural trade with Burkina Faso, and traders in cities like Tamale, they had built their entire livelihoods around the cross-border tomato routes. So market women said they could not feed their families. Transporters who depend on the route were sitting idle. And this crisis was layered on top of an existing tragedy. And then, back in February 2026, 7 Ghanaian tomato traders were killed in a militant attack in Titao, a town in northern Burkina Faso. That attack had already disrupted the supply chain weeks before the official ban. Traders had already classified the northern corridor as dangerous. So, even before the government's directive, the tomatoes had already slowed to a trickle. The ban has been lifted. The trucks are moving. The prices will start to come down. But none of the systematic weaknesses that made this crisis possible have been resolved. And this is where I want to be balanced, because there are two sides to these conversations, and both of them deserve honest examination. On the Burkina Faso side, and I want to be clear about this, the government had every right to prioritize its own domestic industry. That is what sovereignty means. You build factories. You need raw materials. You secure your supply chain. That is textbook industrial policy. And the very fact that Burkina Faso built 3 processing plants in under 2 years, funded primarily by its own citizens through a popular shareholding model, is worth studying. That is not foreign aid. That is not a loan from an international financial institution. That is ordinary Burkinabe people putting their own savings into a national project. And whatever anyone thinks about the politics of that government, the economic model deserves serious analysis. But here is the other side. When a country imposes a sudden export ban on a commodity that its neighbors depends on for daily survival, the human cost is real. Market women in Tamale who lost income for 2 weeks did not cause the dependency. The transporters who sat idle did not create the imbalance. And the consumers who watched prices double overnight, did not fail to invest in agriculture. Those are ordinary people caught between policy decisions made in two capitals. And any honest analysis has to acknowledge that. Burkina Faso's industrial ambition is legitimate, but the destruction it caused to vulnerable people in a neighboring country is also legitimate. Both things can be true at the same time. So let me pause. What have we seen so far? One decision in Ouagadougou exposed fragilities from Accra to Tamale. But this is not a Ghana-Burkina Faso story. It is an African story with a tomato-shaped headline. Let me show you why. The tomato trade in West Africa is far bigger and far more complex than most people realize. An OECD report published in 2025 by the Sahel and West African Club Examination Intra-Regional Tomato Trade found something that should get everyone's attention. Official trade statistics show that Ghana, Ivory Coast, and Niger are the only West African countries formally importing fresh tomatoes from the region for a combined annual value of around $30 million. But when you factor in unrecorded trade, the informal flows that bypass border controls, the total regional tomato market nearly quadruples to $111 million annually. And the composition changes dramatically. Ghana remains the largest market at around $40 million. But Nigeria, a country most people do not associate with tomato imports from Burkina Faso, comes in second at $37 million. Ivory Coast sits at around $6 million, and Benin and Niger follow after that. Let me say that again. Nigeria is the second largest importer of Burkinabe tomatoes in West Africa, not through formal channels, through informal cross-border trade that official statistics do not capture. That means when Burkina Faso imposed the export ban, the ripple effects were not limited to Accra and Tamale. They extended to markets in Nigeria, in Ivory Coast, in Togo, in Benin, wherever traders had been sourcing tomatoes through both official and unofficial networks. Let me talk about Nigeria for a moment, because Nigeria has its own version of this problem, and it is sitting right inside its own borders. Nigeria is Africa's second largest producer of fresh tomatoes, with an annual output of roughly 4 million metric tons. But the country also loses an enormous share of that production to post-harvest waste. Some estimates put the figure at 40 to 50%. Nearly half of the tomatoes Nigeria grows never reach a plate or a factory, and the country's processing capacity has never kept pace with demand. Nigeria's largest tomato processing plant, the Dangote facility in the northern city of Kano, was launched in 2016 with a $20 million investment and the capacity to produce 1,200 tons of tomato paste daily. It shut down the following year, reopened in 2019, struggled for years. Other processing facilities faced the same cycle, shutting down during the off-season because the price of fresh tomatoes skyrockets and production becomes unprofitable. The result is that Nigeria, a country that grows millions of tons of tomatoes, still imports over $1 billion worth of tomato paste and concentrates annually. The demand stands at roughly 2 to 3 million metric tons per year, and the gap between what is produced, what is lost, and what is consumed is filled by imports from China, from Europe, and from other parts of the world. That is the same trap that Ghana finds itself in with Burkina Faso, just on a different scale. A country with the land, the climate, and the labor to feed itself, importing a basic food item because it never built the processing and storage infrastructure to close the gap. And I want to be fair to Nigeria as well. The government has taken steps. There is a tomato policy from 2017. Tariffs were raised on imported concentrates. Seed distribution programs have been rolled out. In 2025, the tomato market actually stabilized for the first time in over 2 decades. Stakeholders reported a bumper harvest. So, progress is happening, but it is slow. And the underlying fragilities, the post-harvest losses, the seasonal price swings, the processing bottlenecks remain. Now let me bring in Ivory Coast and Cameroon because both countries are part of this story too, even though they have received less attention. Ivory Coast sources fresh tomatoes from Burkina Faso through both formal and informal trade channels. The OECD data puts their annual imports at around $6 million compared to Ghana and Nigeria, but significant for border communities and urban markets that rely on that supply. When Burkina Faso shut the export window, Ivorian traders faced the same squeeze that Ghanaian traders faced: reduced supply, rising prices, and uncertainty about how long the disruption would last. Cameroon is in a different position. Cameroon is actually one of the larger tomato producers in Central Africa, and the country hosted the very WTO ministerial conference in Yaoundé, where Ghana and Burkina Faso held the discussions that helped to resolve the ban. But Cameroon faces its own versions of the same challenge, which is high post-harvest losses, limited processing capacity, and a reliance on imports of tomato paste from outside the continent. So, while Cameroon may not be directly dependent on Burkinabe tomatoes, the broader lesson applies. No African country is immune from the dynamics that this story has exposed. So quickly before we continue, it has come to our attention that a significant number of our amazing viewers are not yet subscribed to the channel. So please, I need you to take a second, subscribe, and tap that notification bell for alerts, because this is the only way you can support our growth and encourage us to keep going. And also, tell us where you're tuning in from, and tell us, now that the ban has been lifted, do you think Ghana will actually follow through on building local capacity, or will everything go back to normal until the next crisis? Type yes if you think they will follow through, and also type no if you think they will not, and then tell us why. Let us quickly warm up the charts. Let me address the forward-looking part of this story, because the Ghanaian government has made some commitments, and those commitments deserve both acknowledgement and scrutiny. Ghana's Deputy Minister for Food and Agriculture, John Dumelo, announced a production target of 200,000 to 300,000 metric tons of dry season tomatoes within the next 2 to 3 years. He expressed confidence that within 3 to 4 years, Ghana could become self-sufficient in tomato production. And within 5 to 6 years, the country could halt total importation from Burkina Faso and other neighboring countries. The government has referenced initiatives under its Feed the Industry and Feed Ghana programs, including expanding irrigation infrastructure, supporting large-scale farming, and strengthening linkages between farmers and processors. Trial cultivation programs are underway in the Upper East region, in Garo and Talensi, where farmers have already begun dry season tomato production. Those are reasonable targets, and I want to give credit where credit is due. The fact that the Deputy Agriculture Minister went on national media, acknowledged the dependency, and laid out a timeline is more transparency than most governments offer. But I also want to be honest. When asked directly whether producing an additional 200,000 to 300,000 metric tons would make Ghana self-sufficient, Dumelo himself admitted that it would not. Ghana's annual demand is 800,000 metric tons. Even hitting those targets would still leave a massive gap. And when you compare Ghana's average tomato yield, roughly 7,800 kilograms per hectare, the global leaders like Morocco at 1.3 million metric tons on ground, around 14,000 hectares, on the Netherlands producing 880,000 metric tons, on under 2,000 hectares using greenhouse systems, you begin to see the scale of the challenge. The Food and Beverages Association of Ghana was even more blunt. In a press statement, they described the crisis as clear evidence of weakness, poor planning, and policy failure within Ghana's agricultural sector. They pointed out that Ghana has vast agricultural land, irrigation dams, agricultural colleges, research institutions, extension officers, and a full Ministry of Food and Agriculture, and still cannot produce enough tomatoes to feed its own population. They gave the ministry a 90-day ultimatum to demonstrate measurable results or face calls for restructuring. That is not the opposition talking. That is the private sector. The people who process and sell food for a living, telling the government that the status quo is unacceptable. And here is what I want every viewer to take away from this. This is very important. The ban lasted roughly 2 weeks. It caused real hardships. It disrupted livelihoods. It drove up prices. And it exposed a dependency that has existed for years but was never treated as urgent. But the ban is over. The pressure is off. And the danger, the real danger, is that everything goes back to the way it was. That the commitment gets delayed. That the irrigation projects stall. That the processing investments never materialize. And that 6 months from now, when the next disruption comes, whether it is another export ban or another security incident or a climate shock, Ghana is in exactly the same position it was on March 16. Because that is the pattern across this continent. Crisis hits, government makes promises, the crisis passes, and the promises fade. The cycle repeats itself. But the pattern is not inevitable. It is a choice. And the countries that are breaking it, the countries that are investing in processing, that are mobilizing their own citizens to fund industrial projects, that are keeping value within their borders, those countries are showing that another path exists. You do not have to be the richest country. You do not have to have the most fertile land. What you need is the will to build and the discipline to follow through. I want to say this as clearly as possible. Food is sovereignty. And any nation that lets someone else hold the tap to its food supply is building its future on a foundation it does not control. The ban was a 2-week disruption, but the lesson it carries should last a generation. So, I turn it over to you. For my Ghanaian viewers, what is the one concrete policy you would prioritize first to break the import dependency? For my viewers in Nigeria, in Ivory Coast, in Cameroon, where do you see the same tomato-style vulnerability in your own country? And for everyone watching, do you think the model of citizen-funded processing plants, the kind Burkina Faso has built, should be replicated across the continent? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Let us have a serious conversation about this, not from emotion, but from a strategic standpoint. I want to hear your analysis. I'll be reading your comments and featuring some of them in future episodes. So, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for thinking with me. If this episode helped you think differently about a story most people dismissed as being about tomatoes, please do not keep it to yourself. Share it in your group chat and invite them to join us here as we break it down together. And do not forget to subscribe. My name is Solomon, and until next time, to take care.